A black mother returns from a long trip, eager to finally hold her child again. But when she steps off the plane, everything changes. A white woman targets her, accusing her of being unfit to raise her own daughter. The woman tries to take her child, but the mother refuses to back down. What happens next is shocking, as the mother stands her ground, forcing the airline and law enforcement to confront their deep-seated bias. A fight for justice erupts, and the truth comes to light, setting off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. If you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just another day in the airport, but it was about to change forever. The night sky stretched endlessly beyond the airplane window. A deep, inky black broken only by the occasional flicker of distant stars. The hum of the engines was steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat carrying its passengers through the cold night. Bianca Carter sat between her husband, Lenny, and their daughter, Ellie, a 6-year-old with sleepy eyes and tiny hands that clutched a stuffed bear. It had been a long trip. Paris was beautiful, yes, but home was home. New York awaited them. Bianca reached over, brushing a stray braid from Ellie's forehead. The child had fought sleep for hours, babbling about castles and street performers, until exhaustion finally claimed her. Now, she lay curled against her mother's side, her small chest rising and falling in the deep rhythm of a child at peace. Bianca exhaled, her own body beginning to relax for the first time in hours. She did not know that this moment would be the last time she would ever feel peace. The first sign that something was wrong came in a whisper. It was a feeling more than a sound. A shift in the air. A presence moving where there should have been stillness. Ellie stirred, not waking but shifting slightly, as if something in the dark had called to her. Bianca's eyes fluttered open, but she was too tired to fully wake. A mistake. She would spend years replaying this moment in her mind, wondering if she should have sat up, if she should have taken Ellie's hand, if she should have held on just a little tighter. But she didn't. And when she woke again, Ellie was gone. The second sign came in the form of silence. Not an ordinary silence, the kind that exists in the quiet hours of a long flight, but a hollow, unnatural silence. A mother's instinct does not wait for evidence. It does not pause for logic. It does not need to be seen to believe. Bianca sat up so quickly that Lenny stirred beside her. Confused, her hands moved before her mind could catch up, feeling for warmth, for fabric, for anything. But all she found was an empty seat. The blanket was rumpled. The stuffed bear lay on the floor, abandoned. Ellie? Lenny was fully awake now. Bianca turned, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The silence around them stretched. The other passengers remained undisturbed. Some snored softly, others dozed with their heads tilted against the seats. The overhead lights glowed dimly, casting long shadows against the narrow aisles. But Ellie was not there. Ellie? Bianca called again, her voice sharper now. Urgent. Nothing. No small footsteps returning. No sleepy child rubbing her eyes and mumbling an apology. Nothing. And that was when the fear truly took hold. The third sign came in the form of disbelief. The flight attendant approached, her professional smile already in place. The carefully curated expression of someone used to managing small inconveniences. Ma'am, can I help you? Bianca barely registered the woman's presence. My daughter. She breathed. She's gone. The flight attendant blinked, the smile flickering just slightly. Are you sure she didn't? Quote. She was right here. Bianca's voice was rising now, cutting through the cabin, shaking awake the strangers who did not yet know they were about to become witnesses. Lenny was already out of his seat, scanning the aisles, looking toward the bathrooms, the galley, anywhere a small child could have wandered. But there was no movement. No shadow of tiny feet slipping back into view. Just the impossible fact that a 6-year-old girl had vanished from an airplane flying 30,000 feet in the air. The flight attendant's posture stiffened. Her eyes flicked toward her colleagues in the galley, an unspoken conversation passing between them. Bianca saw it immediately. The doubt, the hesitation, the way the woman's gaze shifted. Not with urgency, but with suspicion. The kind that black mothers know too well. We need to check the plane, Lenny said, his voice firm. Of course, the flight attendant said, but there was something careful in her tone. Something slow, as if she were considering not how to help, but how to contain. Bianca's breath came in short bursts now. She did not have time for their doubts. Find my child. The force in her voice shattered the calm. The other passengers were awake now, murmuring, stretching, trying to understand what was unfolding around them. A missing child? A black child? On a plane? Bianca could feel the shape of the story forming in their minds. Some would believe her. Some would wonder if the child had ever been there at all. And some, too many, would look at Bianca and Lenny and see the same old lies. The same old accusations that had never been spoken but had always been present. Had they lost her? Had she run away? Had they done something to her themselves? Then came the fourth sign. The final sign. That told Bianca everything she needed to know about how this would play out. A man in uniform appeared from the front of the cabin. A security officer. Bianca did not know his name. Did not need to. She had met men like him before. The way they entered a room with the certainty that they were in control. The way they looked at people like her. Black, grieving, afraid, and measured their words before speaking, as if deciding whether she deserved help or interrogation. His gaze settled on Bianca first. Then Lenny. And then, in the cold, bureaucratic tone of a man who had already chosen his conclusion, he asked, "Are you sure your daughter was on this flight?" Bianca felt something inside her crack. It was not a surprise. It was recognition. The sinking, bone-deep knowing that this was not going to go the way it should. She had stepped onto this plane as a mother. But now she was something else. A suspect in her own grief. And Ellie was still gone. The moment Ellie Carter disappeared, the world did not stop. The engines still hummed, steady and indifferent. The plane still sliced through the sky, moving forward, as if the absence of a child meant nothing at all. But for Bianca Carter, time had broken apart. She stood in the narrow aisle, her breath shallow, her hands trembling, her mind screaming the one truth she knew with certainty. Her daughter was gone. And yet, the first battle she had to fight was not against who took Ellie, nor against where she had gone. The first battle was against whether or not the world would believe she was missing at all. The first door that closed. The security officer who had arrived. A man with sharp eyes, a firm jaw, and the ease of someone used to being obeyed. Did not reach for a radio. Did not order the plane to be searched. Did not even look concerned. Instead, he studied Bianca and Lenny with the measured gaze of a man deciding whether to handle them or dismiss them entirely. "We'll look into it," he said, voice calm, clipped. "Look into it?" Bianca's voice rose, the words barely contained. "My daughter is missing. Do something." The officer did not flinch. He folded his arms. "There are procedures," he said. Procedures. Bianca wanted to scream. Her child had vanished. There was no procedure for that. Beside her, Lenny spoke, his voice lower, controlled in the way black men are taught to be when speaking to white authority figures. "She was right here," he said. "She is 6 years old. She did not just walk off this plane." The security officer exhaled through his nose. "Sir, I understand that you're upset. But let's go through this step by step." Step by step. Bianca could see it already. The slowness, the delays, the minutes turning into hours while the people who could help instead questioned, debated, doubted. This was how black emergencies were treated. Not with urgency, with suspicion. She had seen it before. Not with missing children, but with missing justice, with missing concern, with missing compassion. Always missing. And now Ellie was missing, too. The second door that closed. The other passengers were watching now. Some with curiosity, some with concern, and some with that look. The one that asked, without words, what did they do? Because that was the first assumption. Wasn't it? That the fault lay not with the system. Not with the airline. Not with some unknown force that had taken their child. But with them. Bianca turned sharply, scanning their faces, daring someone to meet her eyes. One woman, a middle-aged white lady in a pearl necklace, looked away too quickly. A man in a business suit whispered something to his seatmate. No one said it out loud. But she could feel it, sitting heavy in the air like smoke. What kind of parents lose a child on a plane? As if Bianca had simply misplaced Ellie the way one misplaces a set of keys. As if her fear was an inconvenience. She could feel the narrative turning against her. She had lost control of the story. And that terrified her almost as much as losing Ellie itself. The third door that closed. The flight crew was slow to act. The pilot had been notified but had not left the cockpit. The other flight attendants whispered in low voices, their faces unreadable. And the security officer, the man who had been given authority over this moment, the man who held the power to force the doors open, to demand a full search, to halt this plane if necessary, was still asking questions. When was the last time you saw her? Did you see anyone take her? Is it possible she wandered off? Bianca's hands shook. She is 6. She did not wander anywhere. She is gone. And yet, no alarms, no full cabin sweep, no lockdown, nothing. As if the possibility of losing a black child in midair was simply too absurd to be real. And so, the burden fell, not on the security team, not on the airline, but on Bianca, on Lenny, on them, to prove that their daughter had been here, to prove that she was gone, to prove that she mattered enough to stop the world for. But Bianca had lived in America too long. She knew this truth, though it burned in her throat. They would have stopped the plane already if Ellie had been white. The last door that closed. Ma'am, I need you to remain calm. The officer said. Remain calm. Remain calm. Remain calm. Bianca felt something snap. She stepped forward, closing the space between her and the officer. Her voice a sharp blade. Do you have children? The question cut through the noise. The security officer stiffened. He opened his mouth, hesitated. Bianca's voice dropped lower, steadier. If your child was missing, she said, each word slow, deliberate, merciless, would you be standing here? Would you be waiting? The officer's jaw tightened. No answer. Bianca did not blink. Her voice rose now, not just for him, but for everyone on that plane to hear. I am not asking you, she said. I am telling you. Find my child. The flight crew stilled. The passengers started. And finally, the officer lifted his radio. He spoke into it, low and clipped. A search was ordered. Bianca did not thank him. She did not exhale. Because it should never have taken this long. Because the fight was not over. Because Ellie was still gone. And somewhere, beyond the closed doors of this airplane, a 6-year-old black girl was waiting for someone to come find her. But she would not wait forever. And neither would Bianca. The search began, but not with urgency, not with the kind of desperation that a missing child on a plane should have warranted. Not with the kind of speed that might have meant the difference between finding Ellie or losing her forever. No, the search began the way all things began when black people demanded urgency in a world designed to slow them down. It began with questions, with delays, with the creeping suspicion that this was somehow their fault. And time, that merciless thief, was slipping away. The first betrayal. The cabin crew. Bianca Carter stood in the cramped aisle, her hands clenched at her sides. The flight attendants moved through the rows now, stopping at each passenger, asking polite, careful questions. Did you see the girl? Did you notice anything unusual? Are you sure? But there was no panic. No sirens. No sense that they were searching for a child who could be in danger. They moved like people asking about a lost purse. Not a lost daughter. And when Bianca looked into their faces, really looked, she saw what she feared most. Not urgency. Not concern. Doubt. She turned to Lenny, her voice low, shaking. They don't believe us, she whispered. Lenny's jaw was tight, his shoulders squared, his hands curled into fists he could not afford to use. I know, he said. And that was the worst part. That was always the worst part. That it was not surprising. That it was expected. That the world had trained them to know. Deep in their bones. That their fear, their grief, their very existence would always be a case to be proven. Not a truth to be accepted. The second betrayal. The passengers. Some of them were still pretending not to watch. Bianca could see them, eyes flicking up from their books. Their screens. Their neatly folded newspapers. A young white woman in a silk blouse offered her a small, hesitant smile. "I'm sure she's just hiding," she said, as if Bianca should laugh. Should exhale. Should not be so dramatic. A man in a business suit muttered, shaking his head. Maybe she went to the wrong seat. As if Bianca hadn't checked. As if Lenny hadn't searched every inch of the plane. As if they were two frantic, clueless parents making a fuss over nothing. Bianca wanted to scream. Instead, she turned. She found the old man in seat 3A. White, late 60s, the kind of face carved by time and certainty. He had not spoken yet. Had not offered false comfort. Had not pretended to care. But he had been watching. And Bianca knew that look, too. It was the look of a man deciding whether to get involved. A man who had lived long enough to know how these stories end. A man who was choosing to stay silent. Bianca met his gaze, and for a moment, she thought, maybe he would stand. Maybe he would say something. Maybe he would use the voice that had always carried weight in rooms that denied hers. Maybe. But then he sighed. And he looked away. And Bianca understood. He had already chosen his side. The third betrayal. The system. The security officer returned. Bianca could see it in his face before he even spoke. The decision had already been made. "There's no sign of her," he said. "Now we will keep looking. Now we are searching every inch of this plane. There's no sign of her." As if Ellie had never been here at all. Bianca stepped forward. "What does that mean?" she asked. Her voice dangerous now. The officer shifted. "Uncomfortable. It means we've checked all the logical places," he said. "Careful. Measured. She's not in the bathrooms. Not in the galley. Not in any empty seats." Lenny inhaled sharply. "And the illogical places?" he said. Voice tight. "Have you checked those?" Silence. A hesitation. A flicker of something in the officer's expression. And then, the final insult. "Ma'am, sir," he said, his voice just a little too calm. A little too practiced. "Is there any chance your daughter could have been mistaken for another child?" Bianca's breath caught. Lenny took a step forward before stopping himself. "What are you saying?" Bianca asked. Her voice low. Controlled. The officer tilted his head. "I'm saying, is it possible she wasn't actually on this flight?" And there it was. Not a search. Not a rescue. An interrogation. Bianca's vision blurred with rage. "Are you?" Her voice caught in her throat. Breaking in her own disbelief. "Are you saying we imagined our own child?" The officer did not blink. "I'm saying that the airline records show 2 adults on this ticket. No mention of a child." Bianca swayed. For a moment, she could not breathe. Lenny caught her arm. "That's a mistake," he said, his voice almost too steady. "A clerical error. We checked in as a family. We went through security together. You can check the cameras." A pause. A long, dangerous pause. And then, the words Bianca would never forget. "The system doesn't show her. The system. The system. The one that had never been made for them in the first place." The final betrayal. Time itself. The minutes were stacking up. Every second that passed was another chance lost. Another door closing. Another mile between Ellie and the people trying to find her. And Bianca understood. She had been right all along. They weren't searching. They were waiting. Waiting for her and Lenny to break. Waiting for them to snap. To cry. To scream. So they could become the story. So that Ellie's absence would not be the crisis. But their anger would. And that was when Bianca knew. This would not be a rescue. This would be a fight. And she would burn the whole sky down before she lost. She turned to the passengers. To the crew. To the strangers watching from the sidelines. She did not care anymore who was uncomfortable. Her voice filled the cabin. "My daughter was here. She is missing. And if you do not find her, I will make sure that when this plane lands, the whole damn world knows what happened here." And for the first time. For the first, fragile time, she saw it. A crack. A flicker of fear in the officer's eyes. Because he knew what she knew. If they let her leave this plane without Ellie, the truth would not belong to them anymore. And so, the search truly began. Finally. Too late. But finally. And Bianca prayed that they had not already run out of time. The search had begun. But Bianca Carter did not trust it. Because she knew. She had always known. That when black people go missing, the world does not move fast enough to bring them home. She had seen the difference. When a little white girl disappeared, there were helicopters in the sky before the mother could even finish screaming her name. When a little black girl disappeared, the first question was never where is she? It was are you sure? And now, in the middle of the sky, in a metal cage hurtling through the night, Bianca was sure of only one thing. They were running out of time. The first lie. The airline. The head flight attendant stood near the cockpit door. Arms crossed. Voice clipped and professional. There is no record of an unaccompanied minor boarding this flight, she said. Bianca's hands trembled. She wasn't an unaccompanied minor. She shot back. She was with us. The attendant barely reacted. I understand your concern, ma'am. Concern. The way they spoke when they wanted to make your pain small enough to ignore. Lenny stepped forward, his voice firm. We checked in as a family. You saw us. You took our tickets. The attendant did not flinch. Sir, I handle dozens of families a day. I don't recall every passenger. Lenny clenched his jaw. Bianca saw the war happening behind his eyes. The war every black man has to fight in moments like these. Stay calm. Stay polite. Even when your child is missing. Even when the people who should be helping are standing in your way. Because if you raise your voice, you become the problem. Bianca grabbed Lenny's hand before he could say something he couldn't take back. She turned to the attendant. Voice sharp as glass. Then check the security footage. Silence. The flight attendant hesitated. The first crack in the lie. Because Bianca knew what they knew. The airport had cameras. And if they checked them, they would see Ellie walking through that gate. See her stepping onto this plane. See her exactly where she was supposed to be. Unless. Bianca's breath caught. Unless someone had erased it. The second lie. The passengers. Passengers were watching now. Some with sympathy. Some with impatience. Some with that quiet, dangerous neutrality that let injustice thrive. A woman in the front row. White. Blonde. Expensive looking. Sighed loudly. Maybe she got off before takeoff. She suggested. You should check with the airport when we land. Bianca turned slowly, her stare cutting through the woman's false kindness. She is 6, Bianca said, voice ice cold. She did not walk off the plane. The woman shrugged, as if losing a black child was simply an unfortunate accident. As if it were not worth the urgency of stopping everything until she was found. And Bianca understood. These people were not going to help. They had already decided not to care. Because a missing black child was not enough to delay their comfort. Because Ellie was not enough. The third lie. The police. The security officer was back. He had spoken to the captain. The plane would land in an hour. They would alert the authorities on the ground. Bianca stared at him, unblinking. No, she said. The officer frowned. Ma'am, I assure you. Quote. Bianca cut him off. You're not waiting until we land. You're calling them now. The officer did not move. And Bianca knew why. Because the moment they called it in, the moment they made it official, it would become something they couldn't ignore. It would mean a missing black girl had to be treated like a missing white girl. And that was the last thing they wanted. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You're hoping she just turns up, aren't you? The officer stiffened. You're hoping we get to New York. And she's suddenly sitting in her seat. And all of this goes away. Because you don't want to explain why you didn't act fast enough. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He had nothing to say to that. Because it was true. And Bianca was done playing their game. You call them now, she said, her voice shaking with rage. With grief. With something they were not ready for. Or when this plane lands. I will tell the whole world that you let my daughter disappear in midair and did nothing. And finally, the officer picked up his radio. And the world began to move. Too late. But it moved. The clock is ticking. The announcement came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are conducting a cabin-wide search for a missing child. Please remain seated as we check all areas of the aircraft. Bianca exhaled, but she did not relax. She turned to Lenny. They waited too long, she whispered. Lenny nodded. They always do. And then, a scream. From the back of the plane. A flight attendant, voice shaking. Over here, we found something. Bianca and Lenny ran. Passengers twisted in their seats, craning their necks, watching with something like hunger. And then Bianca saw it. Not Ellie, but her stuffed bear, crushed, abandoned, stuffed halfway between the wall and the seat. And next to it, something else, something worse. A tiny, crumpled note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. 4 words. I didn't want to go. The world stopped. Bianca stared. Her body felt like it had been drained of air, of blood, of everything except fear. Lenny grabbed the note. Read it. And then he turned to Bianca. His voice barely more than a whisper. Someone took her. The note sat between Bianca and Lenny like a wound that refused to close. I didn't want to go. 4 words, scrawled in a child's shaky handwriting. 4 words that confirmed what Bianca already knew in her bones. Ellie hadn't wandered off. She hadn't gotten lost. She had been taken. And yet, when Bianca looked up, looked around, she saw no urgency, no panic, no fear, except her own. Because when black people scream, the world does not hear them. Or worse, it hears and chooses not to listen. The first failure. The police are coming. To question, not to save. The security officer was back. Radio still in hand. Face still too composed for a man who had just learned that a child had been abducted on his watch. We've contacted the authorities in New York, he said. They'll be waiting at the gate. Bianca clenched her fists. They'll be waiting, she repeated. Why are they not acting now? Why aren't they tracing this plane? Why aren't we landing immediately? The officer signed. Like she was the problem. Like her urgency was an inconvenience. Not a necessity. Ma'am, he said carefully, we can't divert a flight for a missing child. A missing child. Not a kidnapped child. Not a stolen child. A missing child. As if Ellie had misplaced herself. As if Bianca had simply forgotten where she had left her. Bianca's breath came in short, sharp bursts. Lenny grabbed her arm, grounding her, keeping her from exploding. But her voice was still sharp enough to cut. You let my daughter disappear, she said. And now you want me to wait? The officer's expression didn't change. Because this was not a crisis for him. Not the way it would have been if Ellie had golden curls and a name like Madison or Emily. If Ellie had been a little white girl, this plane would be on the ground already. Bianca knew it. Lenny knew it. The officer knew it too. And still, they stayed in the air. Still, the world did not stop for Ellie. The second failure. The witnesses WHO chose not to see. Bianca turned now, away from the officer, away from the uniform that had already betrayed her. She turned to the passengers. To the people who had been there. Who had seen something. Who might have saved her daughter if they had only been paying attention. A black woman near the back of the plane wouldn't meet her eyes. Bianca recognized that look. It was not indifference. It was fear. The kind of fear that had been trained into them both. Stay out of trouble. Don't get involved. The world is dangerous enough for us already. Bianca's anger cracked, just slightly, into something softer. Because she knew that woman had seen things, too. She had learned, long ago, that to survive, sometimes you had to pretend not to see. Bianca understood. But she was not in the mood for understanding. She turned instead to a man near the aisle. White, well-dressed, mid-50s, the kind of man who always expected to be listened to. And she asked the question that had been burning inside her since the moment this nightmare began. Did you see anything? The man hesitated. And that was all Bianca needed to know. Because hesitation is a confession. Because if you saw nothing, you would say it. Because if you were innocent, you wouldn't have to think. She took a step forward. Her rage a living thing. You saw something. The man shifted uncomfortably. Then, finally, there was a woman. Silence fell over the cabin. Bianca's pulse roared in her ears. Lenny's hand tightened around the seat. What woman? Bianca asked. Voice dangerous now. The man licked his lips. Nervous. She was walking a little girl toward the back of the plane. Bianca stilled. A little girl. A child. Ellie. Lenny spoke. Voice urgent. When? The man hesitated again. And Bianca wanted to grab him. Shake him. Make him understand that every second of his silence was another mile between her and Ellie. I don't know, he admitted. I wasn't paying attention. I assumed she was her mother. Bianca's stomach twisted. Because that was the problem. Wasn't it? Black children are always assumed to belong to someone else. Ellie had been stolen in front of a plane full of people. And no one had stopped it. Because no one had imagined that she could have been taken. Because no one had thought to question why a black girl might be led away. Disappearing into the shadows of the plane. Bianca wanted to scream. She wanted to rip the sky open. Instead, she turned back to the officer. To the flight crew. To every person who had wasted time while her daughter was being pulled further and further away. There's still time, she said, voice steady, if we act now. And finally, the officer lifted his radio again. His voice was different this time. Tighter, sharper. The words came fast. We have an abduction. I repeat, a child abduction. Notify TSA. We need security at the gate. The words rang through the cabin. Passengers stiffened. Because now it was real. Now it could not be ignored. Now, someone had to answer for it. The final failure. The window is closing. The plane was descending. 30 minutes left. Maybe less. Bianca's heart pounded. Because she knew they were running out of time. Whoever had taken Ellie would know by now that the plane was landing. That the search had started. That they would be waiting. And that meant whoever took her had to move. Now. Bianca turned to Lenny. Voice shaking. If she's still here, she whispered. They're going to try to get rid of her before we land. Lenny's face darkened. His hand closed around Bianca's. Because they both knew. The search wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the most dangerous part was still ahead. The descent had begun. Bianca Carter felt it in her bones before she felt it in the tilt of the plane. The ground was rising to meet them. Pulling them back into the world. But Ellie was still missing. She should have been here. Between Bianca and Lenny. Fighting sleep. Asking how much longer. Clutching her stuffed bear in her small hands. But instead, somewhere in this cabin, someone had her. And they were running out of time. Because as soon as the wheels touched down, as soon as that seatbelt light flicked off, the people who had stolen Ellie would move. Slip away. Disappear. Just like she had. The first calculation. WHO knew. WHO didn't. And WHO pretended not to. Bianca scanned the faces around her. She had always known that survival. For black people. For black women. For black mothers. Was a game of reading the room before the room read you. And right now, she was reading the cabin. There were those who had chosen ignorance. The man in the business suit. Staring at his phone like it held the answers to a world he would never have to live in. The woman with the pearl necklace. Who kept adjusting her scarf and sighing loudly. As if Bianca's panic was nothing more than a disruption to her comfort. There were those who had chosen fear. The black woman in the back who had avoided Bianca's eyes. Who had seen something but knew better than to say it. Because she had been trained. Like Bianca had been trained. To mind her own business. Because the business of black people had never been America's concern. And then, there were those who had chosen silence. The flight attendants. Moving stiffly now. Eyes darting toward the cockpit. Waiting for instructions. Waiting to be told what to do instead of knowing what to do. And then, there was the man in 3A. The old white man who had watched. Who had measured. Who had said nothing when the world was crumbling right in front of him. Bianca met his gaze now. And for the first time, he did not look away. There was something in his eyes. Something that might have been regret. Something that might have been recognition. Or maybe it was just a thought too terrible to admit. That he had done this before. That he had watched. In his lifetime. As the world took and took and took from black people. And he had always been exactly where he was now. A witness. But never a participant. The second calculation. Where would they go? Bianca turned back to Lenny. Her voice low. Urgent. They're going to move as soon as we land. She whispered. Lenny nodded. His jaw tight. Bianca could feel his fury. Not the loud kind, but the kind that had been forced into silence. The kind that had been taught restraint. The kind that had been taught to survive. And then, she saw it. His hands. How they clenched and unclenched. How he was holding himself back. Because if Lenny Carter stood up right now, if he so much as raised his voice, if he did what any white father in America would be expected to do for his child, they would not call him a father. They would call him a threat. And Bianca knew it. She reached for his hand, squeezed it, told him with her touch, I know. You are not allowed to be desperate. You are not allowed to be angry. You are not allowed to be the father of a stolen child if it makes them uncomfortable. So Bianca spoke instead. And she spoke with the kind of voice that could not be ignored. She stood, stepping into the aisle. And she did not lower her voice. If anyone moves before this plane is fully searched, she said, they are telling us exactly who they are. The third calculation. The last minutes before chaos. The wheels hit the ground. A slow roll at first. Then the deep roar of the brakes. Then the lurch of the stop. Bianca did not move. She turned. She waited. Because she had given them a choice. Stay seated. Stay silent. Or run. And then, just as she expected, a woman in the back row stood. Too fast. Too desperate. Too soon. She wore a dark coat. A scarf that covered too much of her face. She had been invisible the whole flight. And now, suddenly, she was in motion. Too fast. Bianca's breath caught. And then, before she could move, Lenny Carter stood first, blocking the aisle. His presence alone was enough to stop the woman mid-step. She looked up at him. And in that instant, Bianca saw it. The flicker of panic. The truth, staring back at them. And then, from somewhere deeper in the cabin, a child's cry. Small. Muffled. Ellie. Bianca ran. The fourth calculation. The moment before the moment. She did not remember how she got there. Did not remember pushing past the seats. Past the people. Past the gasps of strangers who had suddenly decided to care. She only knew that when she reached the back of the plane. When she pulled aside the coats. The bags. The space where shadows had been hiding something that should have never been hidden. There she was. Ellie. Small. Afraid. Eyes wide with confusion. But alive. Bianca collapsed. Pulling her into her arms. Hands gripping. Checking. Making sure. Making sure. Making sure. Because no mother believes their child is real again until they feel them. And Bianca felt her. Alive. Breathing. Warm. Ellie clung to her. And whispered. She told me I had to go. And Bianca lifted her head. Eyes burning. Turning toward the woman. The woman who had taken her. The woman who had dared to steal a child in the middle of the sky. The woman who was now frozen. Trapped. Nowhere left to run. Bianca stood. And she did not let go of Ellie. She stepped forward. Slow. Deliberate. A mother walking toward the person who had stolen her child. And she said, without fear, without hesitation, without doubt, you are not leaving this plane. The plane had landed. But the war was not over. Bianca Carter held onto Ellie with one arm and the truth with the other. And the truth was standing right in front of her. A woman, white, middle-aged, draped in the kind of silence that protected people like her. The kind of silence that had allowed her to slip through life unnoticed. Unchallenged. She had taken Ellie. And now, she was standing there, waiting to see if she would get away with it. Because that was the real game. Wasn't it? It was never just about talking. It was about whether or not the world would let her keep what she had stolen. And Bianca had seen too much of that. She had lived it. The white woman who took credit for her work. The white man who stepped ahead of Lenny in line like he had the right to be first. The white neighbor who clutched her purse when Bianca walked by. The endless, exhausting, infuriating erasure of black life. And now, this woman had taken her child. And was waiting to see if she could walk away. Not today. The first battle. The system shows its hand. The flight attendants had frozen. The passengers had stopped moving. Even the security officer, the one who had doubted Bianca at every turn, was just standing there, waiting, as if he wasn't sure what to do next. Because it had happened in front of them. They had seen it. And now, they had a choice. Would they treat this woman like a kidnapper? Would they tackle her to the ground? Would they drag her off the plane in handcuffs? Or would they ask her to explain? Would they let her soften the crime? Would they let her become a victim before she could be named a criminal? Bianca had seen this happen before. She could see the wheels turning in their heads. And she knew exactly how it would go if she didn't stop it now. She needs to be arrested, Bianca said, her voice like steel. The security officer, the same man who had doubted her from the start, tilted his head, like he was considering it. Ma'am, he said, let's not jump to conclusions. Bianca's vision flared red. Jump to conclusions? What conclusion had he jumped to when he doubted that Ellie was even missing? What conclusion had he jumped to when he treated Bianca like a hysterical black woman instead of a mother whose child had been stolen? Bianca stepped forward. Ellie gripped her tighter. And Bianca made sure her voice carried across the entire plane. She stole my daughter, she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. And now you're thinking about how to make sure she doesn't go to jail. The silence that followed was loud enough to break mountains. Because everyone knew she was right. They knew it. And they hated that she had said it. Because if they named the crime, they would have to answer for it. And the one thing white America had never been good at, the one thing it had always refused to do, was the answer for what it had done. The second battle. The woman finds her words. The woman, the kidnapper, the thief, the stranger who had taken Ellie in plain sight, finally spoke. And, of course, her voice was soft, trembling, as if she were the one who had been wronged. This is a misunderstanding, she whispered. Lenny's entire body went rigid. Bianca felt Ellie flinch. Because even Ellie knew what that meant. A misunderstanding. That was the word white women used when they needed to be saved. That was the word that let them cry in courtrooms and walk free. That was the word that had gotten black men lynched in the past. That was the word that had gotten black women branded as angry, difficult, unworthy of protection. That was the word that let white women commit the crime and still be the victim. Bianca had seen too many misunderstandings turn into acquittals. So she turned, not to the woman, but to the officer. And she dared him. Are you going to let her walk off this plane? The final battle. Choosing a side. The officer's radio crackled. Another voice, from the ground, from the people who had been forced to take this seriously, came through. We have the NYPD waiting at the gate. Child abduction case. Do not release the suspect. Suspect. Not a misunderstanding. Not a mistake. Suspect. The word landed like a gunshot. The woman gasped. And finally, Bianca saw it. Fear. Not her own. Hers had been there from the moment Ellie disappeared. But now, for the first time, it was in the woman's face. She knew. She wasn't walking away from this. The world had forced itself to see. And Bianca would make damn sure it wouldn't look away again. The landing that wasn't the end. When the doors finally opened. When the officers stepped onto the plane. When they took the woman by the arms and walked her into the flashing red and blue lights waiting for her on the tarmac. Bianca did not breathe. Not yet. Not until they were outside. Not until Ellie was standing in the open air. Safe. Real. No longer trapped in the in-between. Not until she was in Bianca's arms. And Bianca could finally whisper, I've got you. And Ellie, small, tired, but still whole, whispered back, I knew you'd find me. Bianca closed her eyes. And for the first time since stepping on that plane, she let herself believe it was over. The headlines would say a little black girl had been rescued. They would say the police had acted swiftly. They would say that justice had prevailed. But Bianca Carter knew the truth. Her daughter had been stolen. And the world had tried its best not to notice. She knew what would happen next. She had lived long enough in this country to know how the story would be rewritten. How they would erase the doubt, the hesitation, the failure, because America was very good at pretending it had never abandoned you. The first aftermath. The questions that shouldn't be asked. The reporters came fast. The cameras flashed. The microphones were shoved in her face. And the questions. Oh, the questions. How does it feel to have your daughter back? What would you like to say to law enforcement for their quick response? Do you think this was just a misunderstanding? Bianca could barely contain the rage boiling under her skin. A misunderstanding. They were already softening it. Already shaping it into something more comfortable. More palatable. Because it was easier to believe that mistakes had been made than to face the truth. That a white woman had tried to take her child. And the world had been willing to let it happen. Bianca gripped Ellie tighter. The little girl buried her face in her mother's chest. Exhausted. Drained. Trying to disappear in plain sight. And Bianca realized they weren't asking about Ellie. They weren't asking what it had been like for her to be taken. Hidden. Forced into silence. Because they didn't care about Ellie's voice. They cared about the story. And they wanted Bianca to give them one they could stomach. A neat ending. A forgiveness arc. But Bianca Carter was done giving people comfort at her own expense. So she leaned into the microphone. Into the camera. Into the eyes of the world that had waited too long to see her. And she told the truth. My daughter was missing for hours. And nobody cared until I made them care. The reporters blinked. The officers shifted. The world was not ready for what she had to say. But she said it anyway. The second aftermath. WHO is a criminal? The woman, the kidnapper, the thief, the would-be abductor, was in handcuffs. But Bianca had seen how this story played out before. The woman wasn't being shoved into a police car. She wasn't pushed face down onto the pavement like black men had been for less. No, she was guided. Her hands were cuffed. But gently. She was speaking in hushed tones to the officers. Her lips trembling. Tears forming in her eyes. Crafting her own defense in real time. And Bianca could hear it already. She didn't mean to kidnap her. She has mental health issues. She was just trying to help. She didn't realize. She's not a criminal. Bianca wanted to scream. Because if Lenny had been the one caught walking off with a little white girl, he wouldn't have made it off that plane alive. Because black people don't get the luxury of being misunderstood. They don't get excuses. They don't get softened stories. They only get consequences. And yet, here this woman was, standing between justice and justification. And Bianca knew, by the time this story reached the courtroom, she would not be a kidnapper. She would be a victim. The third aftermath. The world moves on. But she cannot. Days passed. The media found something new to talk about. Another tragedy. Another scandal. Something that made people forget about a black child stolen in midair. But Bianca couldn't forget. Because every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ellie's empty seat. She saw the way the flight attendants had hesitated. She saw the way the passengers had pretended not to see. She saw how long it had taken for anyone to care. And she knew, deep in her bones, that if she had not fought, if she had not screamed, if she had not demanded to be heard, Ellie would be gone, maybe forever, and no one would have remembered her name. No one would have stopped the world for her. And that was the part that broke Bianca the most. Not just that Ellie had almost been stolen, but she had almost been forgotten. The final aftermath. The lesson that should never have to be learned. Ellie stood at the window, staring out at the sky. She had barely spoken about what happened. Not to Bianca, not to Lenny, not to anyone, but tonight, as the sky darkened, as the last bit of daylight faded into something unknowable, Ellie finally whispered, "Would they have cared if I didn't belong to you?" The question shattered something inside Bianca. Because she had no answer. Because she knew what Ellie was really asking. She was asking if her life had value beyond who was willing to fight for it. And Bianca didn't know how to tell her that the answer was no. That in America, black lives have always had to be defended before they could be protected. Without Bianca, without Lenny, without the fight, she would have just been another statistic. Another name lost in the endless sea of missing black children who never get found. And Bianca hated that this was something her daughter had to know at 6 years old. So she wrapped Ellie in her arms. And whispered the only truth she could give her. "I will always find you." And Ellie, small, tired, no longer innocent, but still holding onto something fragile, whispered back, "I know." Bianca closed her eyes. And held on. Because she knew the truth. The world had tried to take her daughter once. And it would try again. And again. And again. Because that is what the world does to black children. But Bianca Carter would be damned if she ever let it win.